Thanks.
Thanks, Jana. Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to this Logic conference call. That is a very timely conference call on protecting digital security during a pandemic. My name is David Skok. I'm the founder and CEO of The Logic, and I'm absolutely delighted to join you today, along with some very distinguished panelists that we will introduce in a moment. But before we do, I want to give our partners for this event, Microsoft Canada, a chance to tell you about what they've been thinking about when it comes to digital security. John Weigelt is the National Technology Officer for Microsoft Canada. And John, I would love it if you could say a few words.
Thanks, David, and thank you to everyone that's joined us today. You know, we've all experienced firsthand how the pandemic has changed the world in ways we could have not previously imagined. The existing business models have been disrupted, our economy has been impacted, and the race to adopt digital services to get business up and running has been steadfast. Our CEO at Microsoft, Satya Nadella, said it best when he said, "We've seen 2 years of digital transformation happen in 2 months. I've seen innovation happen across the country in places where you wouldn't have expected it. We've seen restaurants change to online and curbside delivery, retailers pivot. We've seen all aspects of our business change. At Microsoft, we've been working to support organizations from developing solutions that help people learn and work remotely while supporting frontline workers to research projects tackling COVID. Few of them that I'd like to call out. One is our healthcare AI bot. It's been used by health organizations around the world to screen people for potential coronavirus infections and treatment using AI and natural language processing. We're collaborating with innovators like DNA Stack, who recently launched the COVID-19 Beacon to inform of new ways to fight the virus. We're working with UNICEF to expand Learning Passport to help children and youth affected by COVID-19, continuing their education at home. Really excited about our collaboration with PCL Construction, Insight Enterprise, and Citizen CarePods Corporation. We've helped deliver a CarePod, a customizable smart mobile pod outfitted with infrastructures and capabilities to enable turnkey COVID-19 testing. We've made Microsoft Teams available to those who needed it so you can stay connected and ensure continuity of business and services through this challenging time. And we've partnered with the Canadian Institute for Advanced Research, CIFAR, on the AI COVID-19 Catalyst Grants programs, supporting 14 innovative high-risk, high-reward ideas and projects to address the current COVID-19 outbreak. These are just some of the tremendous examples that show us the role that technology is playing in the fight against COVID-19. As we've leaned in to help with these projects, we've seen how being thoughtful and deliberate about how technologies are used helps bestow confidence in the solutions. Internationally and locally, we've seen countries and companies build digital solutions that leverage new technologies such as tracking, tracing, and testing to limit the spread of the virus. It's imperative that we ensure that privacy is built in from the beginning and people's basic human right to privacy is protected. Now, we've been doing privacy by design since 2004, and so it's core to the way that we build our solutions. Now, even though we're building these digital solutions in time of urgent need, preserving privacy is critical. And these solutions must meet the high standards of transparency, accountability that we demanded before the pandemic. Now, we reinforced our privacy principles with 7 key principles that we recommend for governments, public health authorities, academics, employers, and everybody across the community to build solutions in response to the pandemic. Now, these principles, you'll find that they're quite consistent. You will have heard many of these before in the PIPEDA conversations or in the other privacy conversations in Canada. Firstly, there needs to be meaningful consent, which means being transparent for the reason that you collect data, what data is collected, and really important, how long it's kept. So you only should collect the data with consent in a clear way that helps people appreciate why they're sharing their data and how that's going to be used. It has to be clear and user-friendly. Data from these tracing applications should only be collected for public health purposes. Don't reuse this data elsewhere. We want to be able to trace that physical contact with an infected person. We want to make sure that we have that line of sight and that 360 view of where that person might have been, but we don't repurpose that for unrelated reasons. Public health authorities should only request the types of data that are most useful for fighting the pandemic. Let's be conscious about the data that we're collecting, the amount of data that we're collecting. We want to limit that collection, and we really only want to have that specific data that's required. We want to make sure that we're storing this data securely, and we want to give people the right to choose how their data is stored. You have to be fully in control as a citizen of where to store that data on the device or in the cloud. Let's make sure we have the right safeguards. So security is key. De-identification, encryption. There are great new tools like rotating and random identifiers or decentralized identities that can be used. We also cannot share the health data without consent. So no sharing outside that community and making sure that we only share with that consistent approach. And lastly, we want to make sure that that data is deleted as soon as we don't require it anymore. There's a lot of conversations around what happens when we get back to normal. Well, let's make sure we delete that information and make sure that it's not used for unrelated uses. Now, these principles align with the conversation and the guidance from the Federal Privacy Commissioner and also the Provincial Privacy Commissioners. I think these tools and these solutions will help us come through this pandemic stronger than we were before. And it's evident that in this order for technology to succeed, people need to be in control of their data. They need to be empowered with the information that explains how their data will be collected and used. Companies need to be accountable and responsible for their solutions. And we need to really have this conversation today. The conversation we're having today is critically important, that we can explore the privacy and ethical concerns as we move forward to use data to defeat COVID-19. Thanks, David. Over to you.
Thank you, John. And I definitely agree that this is a really important conversation and a very timely one, given the news of this morning, which we're going to dive into with our expert guests. I want to introduce first Rebecca Finley. Rebecca founded CIFAR's Global Knowledge Mobilization Practice in 2014, what John mentioned, a partnership bringing together experts in industry, civil society, healthcare, and government to accelerate the societal impact of CIFAR's research programs. In 2017, she was responsible for the launch of CIFAR's AI and Society program to support international working groups and thought leadership on the questions AI poses for all aspects of policy and society. And of course, AI is just one part of the conversation right now in the COVID world, and we'll dive into that as well. In 2019, Rebecca was honored as a fellow at the American Association for the Advancement of Science. Welcome, Rebecca. Our other panelist today is Carol Piavison. Carol is the partner and co-founder of INQ Data Law, where her practice concentrates on privacy, cyber readiness, data governance, and artificial intelligence. She regularly counsels clients on a wide range of matters related to privacy, data protection, data governance, ethical AI, and risk management for AI operation. There's a word I won't be able to say. Operationalization. There you go. Prior to founding INQ Data Law, Carol was co-lead of the National Cybersecurity Privacy Data Management Group at McCarthy Tétrault, and she has represented clients before all levels of court in Ontario, as well as the Supreme Court of Canada. And with that, what a great place to start with our two panelists. This morning at 11 a.m., the Prime Minister announced a contact tracing app, although I'm told we shouldn't call it a contact tracing app. It's actually an exposure notification app. The contact tracing will be done by Health Canada. And it uses the Bluetooth-based decentralized Google and Apple API, which was developed with the assistance from BlackBerry and Shopify. And it was really the Ontario Digital Service who led this effort. I'm curious, first of all, both of you are experts in this field. Why don't we start with you, Rebecca, your reaction to the news from the Prime Minister today?
Thanks, David. First of all, let me thank the Logic and you specifically for inviting CIFAR to be a part of this important discussion today. And I'm always delighted to speak after John and to be on a panel with him. And I need to thank Microsoft for their support of CFAR over many initiatives, but most recently with regard to our AI and COVID-19 grants. And it's always a pleasure to be on a panel with Carol. So thanks so much for having me today. And I just wanted to pick up on one of John's comments because I think it connects to the announcement we heard today, which is that we've seen this remarkable turning of attention to the COVID-19 pandemic and the crisis at hand. And we've seen it within the private sector, but we've also seen it within the research community as well. And we see so many of our researchers who have turned their attention to AI, but also many other areas of research, economics, child development, all sorts of areas related to pandemic response, and it's great to see. And it connects to the announcement this morning because we can see by learning about a little bit more about the app that it was volunteers at Shopify who really led some of the early work in this area. So what we know is not a lot at this point, I would say, in terms of the app itself. And I understand from the announcement that it will be followed by some more details with Premier Ford later today. So I'm sure we'll all be watching that with interest. From what we know about the Apple and Google API system that we believe this is based on, it is based on a Bluetooth proximity, what's often called risk exposure or proximity tracing app, which uses the Bluetooth technology as a proxy for assessing your closeness and connection to other individuals that can then be useful in providing potential contact tracing information moving forward. And I think today's announcement speaks to exactly what we were trying to do in the report that we prepared for the Chief Science Advisor on Society, Technology and Ethics in the Pandemic, which is to ensure that technology responds and is useful in the moment, but at the same time is placed within a strong governance framework that protects privacy and also protects many of the other elements that make a healthy democracy in Canada and abroad. So those would be my initial comments.
Great. Thank you. Carol, welcome. And I'm curious what your early thoughts are on the announcement today.
Thank you, David. And first of all, let me start by also thanking you for having us on this panel, for having this discussion, which is a very important discussion right now, and wishing themselves and their families safety and hope everyone's keeping well. I want to pick up on the last point that Rebecca just made about governance. So we, unfortunately today, there was a second major news item, which is Canada tops over 100,000 coronavirus cases. So it is not, while we feel fairly confident that we have passed the worst of the first phase, there are two important things that we know. We know it's not, the coronavirus remains in our communities, and we know that there's a high likelihood that we will face a second wave of coronavirus cases, likely to hit sometime in the fall. The biggest fear is that the second wave will be even worse than the first. And so we need a strong response to dealing with this highly contagious virus. And what we heard today, just a few moments ago from the Prime Minister, was one tool in the toolbox to dealing with this pandemic. We have called it proximity tracing, or a way to determine the sort of proximity of one person to another to determine whether there's any kind of contact. If there is contact with somebody who has tested positive, there would be a way to anonymously notify those who had been in that person's range over the past 14 days that they had come into contact with someone who had tested positive. So this is a form of contact tracing. It is not new. So contact tracing as a response to an epidemic or any type of major outbreak is not new, and it is a critical strategy. The point is, how are you going to manage the governance components, and how do you do what David said, what John said at the beginning, which is to have a strong control and maintain strong control for individuals over their data? How do you get the trust for people to download this app? So what we heard the Prime Minister saying earlier today is that this will be voluntary, but there will be no mandatory requirement to download the app. but that citizens of Canada are being asked to download it as part of their response and participation in the response to the pandemic. Now, we were talking a little bit earlier as to what is the sort of magic number you need to have this contact tracing app be effective. Is it somewhere between 50 to 80% of people who have to participate in order for it to be meaningful? I don't know the exact net number, but what I do know is that we are looking for more, not less participation. And where it's voluntary, the government and those who are offering the app really need to work hard at building that trust component, demonstrating very strong privacy safeguards, and showing and living by the governance structure that they've put in place. Because what we have seen, I saw this a few weeks ago, and I'm not sure if the report is necessarily accurate, but suggestion that contact tracing data was used in tracking protesters at various Black Lives Matter movements. Now, that undermines the trust component. So what we really need to do is go back to what we heard earlier, which is use the data as you say you will use it, delete it when you say you will delete it, and use it for no other purpose, and maintain the anonymity of individuals. So it's critical to hear, putting these various pieces together of voluntary, high numbers required, very important in a tool in the toolbox to respond to an epidemic, pandemic, as the one that we're facing right now, and then needing that governance structure in place to make sure you do what you say you're going to do.
Rebecca, I know you want to get in on that. Just one thing I want to ask you as you respond to it is how, when we talk about the numbers and the threshold to get to 50%, I was talking to Carly Kind at the Ada Lovelace Institute a few weeks ago, and there's nobody close to that level of adoption. So these things are really, is it just an academic debate for now? And then, so my next question is, how do you get that kind of adoption, and do companies play a role? I know there's some conversations around making it a mandatory thing for employers to do with their employees, which leads us down a whole other path of interesting workplace regulations. How do we get there?
Yeah, great question. So I wanted to pick up on the issues that Carol was raising and say that one of the things that I noted in the announcement this morning was the intention to create a testing environment for it, with the province of Ontario initially. And I would strongly encourage governments to truly create a rigorous testing framework within which many of the questions that Carol raised and you've just raised can be fully understood and answered. So you may have seen that Nature magazine came out with a comment piece a couple of weeks ago, making exactly this point. We know how to do testing. We know how to do evaluation. So if we're truly going to understand exactly the question of uptake, how much, what percentage do we actually need? As Carol said, and I know Carly Kind has done a lot of work on this as well. Initially, we thought uptake needed to be well over 60%, almost 80% in order to be useful. We've seen some research lately that's indicating it can be substantially less from that and still have some use. We know that in terms of apps that have already been developed and rolled out elsewhere, as you said, there has not been significant adoption within the population. There have also been concerns raised around whether all dimensions of a population are having access to an app. So who actually has a phone? How does it deal with children who would not have access to the app? What about vulnerable populations like the elderly? So all of these questions we could get some understanding about how an app could usefully supplement a much broader and comprehensive public health strategy focused on well-resourced and well-run testing, tracing, and isolation measures, if we're able to test it in a way. So I would encourage that there be clear evaluation metrics established up front and a strong testing framework put in place so we can understand with this app how well it works for this at this moment in time. But exactly as Carol said, if there is a second wave, wouldn't it be better to know more effectively how technology is able to respond in a second wave, and then potentially for future pandemics as well?
I have a lot to get through in a limited amount of time, but I just want one last question on this for Carol. When we think about what Alberta tried to do, they've already had an app Do you have any sense of what worked and what didn't in Alberta?
So before I comment on that, I just want to make one more point related to what Rebecca was talking about, because I think it's really critical, and I think it's very critical in respect of the concept of trust and how do you build trust to get to voluntary increases in numbers of app users. And that is, as you test and pilot and get information out there, what you really need to do is publish and be transparent. And that does relate to John's point earlier, which is give people the information about what exactly you're doing, how is it working, and then what are the implications. So when we are getting to greater adoption, we're going to want to be tracking that very closely, and we are going to want to have that published out there, because we saw what happened at the outset of the sort of, rewind to March 2020, when we started to shut down the economy, and there was a lot of concern that there just wasn't enough data that was coming out from the federal and provincial governments to give us information about where the pandemic is, where there are clusters, where is there real concern, and then really giving us the tools to respond to it in a meaningful way. So this is data is really critical to us. Data is also something that is highly coveted. It's very personal, and so we have to manage those different aspects all together. I can't comment too much about Alberta, to be honest, but I'll tell you that in Ontario, what I have found is that the regular updating of the public with respect to different emergency measures, which has been on a daily basis, regular updating of how information can or would be used is more effective today than it was 3 months ago. And it's certainly something that I would support the government doing, particularly with an app like this, where there's a lot of trepidation around handing over this information to the government and handing over aspects of this information to private sector.
Okay, great. We're going to move on to AI, but before we do, I just want to prompt if you have questions. There will be a period for Q&A at the end, so please, there's a live event Q&A going on right now, and you're very lucky and fortunate because John is currently answering your questions. So you have one of the smartest people in the country dealing with these things, answering your questions online. Take advantage of it. One of the things that John is responsible for is Microsoft's Responsible AI program. And so I think for Carol and Rebecca, there's a lot of talk about AI. Even pre-COVID, there's a lot of hype around AI. And the thing that I always like to do is just to kind of provide a framing is to ask people, what is AI? Because it seems to be meaning a whole bunch of things to a whole bunch of different people. Carol, why don't we start with you? In 30 seconds or less, kind of a primer 101 for someone like me on what is AI.
Sure. So let me just start by saying that what AI is not is magical, and it is not a wizard. It is not something that hangs over us that will control us. So all of the mystique around what is AI, we can sort of put to the side, particularly now. But what is AI? It's a complex computer system that can analyze massive amounts of information, of data, to draw trends and help with problem solving. And what makes AI particularly interesting to me is its self-learning function and self-executing function, depending on the type of the system. So 30 seconds, that's my definition of AI, though there is no consensus definition. And like I said, the mystique around it creates this very scary notion of those two letters, but really that's an umbrella term that signifies a lot of different applications.
So self-learning. Rebecca, on your end, self-learning to me could sound like the Terminator. Should we be concerned? What is AI to you?
Great question. There's Marvin Minsky has a great phrase. He calls them suitcase words. And it feels to me, these are words that we pack a lot of meaning into, but clearly you pack your suitcase differently than I do. So we pack different meaning into these words. And when you think about artificial and intelligence, and then you put the two together into artificial intelligence, I mean, clearly there's going to be misunderstanding. And as someone who comes from a political theory background, I think about just the social and political structures within which those words are used and the power therein. And so I think it is right to try to be as clear as possible about what we mean. When we talk about AI in Canada, we are, as Carol said, essentially talking about machine learning systems, and particularly two subfields in research we think of as deep learning and reinforcement learning. And those are, so these are algorithms that, rather than following strict rules and directions, are learning based upon the data that they are provided with. And what we know today is that they are learning to make very, very specific predictions about very, very specific terms. And so they are optimized around very specific things. So there is, when we think about artificial intelligence today and how it's working, it may appear to have this component of it, which is sort of this super intelligence, but in fact, we are nowhere near to what people have called artificial general intelligence, or, as you say, robots or killer robots in any way. And so where we see, though, is that can have really transformative potential. So when you think about combining massive data sets with a lot of computing power, you can get this remarkable accuracy around predictions, whether it's in radiology, in healthcare, whether it's defining and finding molecules for potential energy materials or drug targets, or even in literature, right? We've seen it applied to writing by Shakespeare and to determine what's actually by Shakespeare and what might be by others. So so you see it in this way, but I think the most important thing to remember is that it's around a very defined and specific task. And then, of course, it's dependent on the data, right? It's not only dependent upon, but what the data is, what all that the data brings, what limitations there may be in the data, what biases there may be in the data. And so understanding that and developing mechanisms to respond are also critical.
Mm-hmm.
So, Carol, let's talk about the data, because, obviously, with the killing of George Floyd, there is a justifiable social unrest occurring. And one of the ways that can manifest itself is in the data, or in even the algorithms or the learning baseline that there's been reporting about prejudice in algorithms. Mm-hmm. How do we safeguard against that? And if you were to grade where we are on this, do we have to reverse? Is there tech debt on some of this algorithmic bias that we need to reverse engineer out at this phase?
So there's been, over the last 3 years, the discussion around ethics in AI and really being mindful of your data set and its use in AI and in any type of big data application has come to the fore in ways that we have not really seen before. And in part, that's because we have much more data and we are becoming much more dependent on trying to analyze that data for specific social outputs. So we have seen this discussion, and we have seen real movement. Maybe it's actually, I'd give it more than the last 3 years, if that's what I said, probably the last 5-6 years, to try to establish the principles, the governance structure around how to build in trust by design. So let me talk to you about this concept for a second, because we've talked a lot about privacy by design over the last 20 years. But trust by design is a slightly different concept, where what you're doing from the outset, it sort of follows the same process, but what you're doing from the outset is you are redesigning your business model so that you are thinking about those ethical principles right from the beginning. And the reason you're doing this is because you recognize the power of this technology. It is very persuasive, of course, depending on context, but it can be very persuasive. It can have a very strong impact on individual lives. The example I'll give you is in the allocation of medical services and resources in the US. We saw a case not long ago where the algorithm was prioritizing certain services to richer white men as opposed to poorer Black men, because frankly, the data set was skewed in that favor. And the reason for that is because the richer white men were accessing services more than poorer Black men, not that they were actually sicker. So not that they actually needed those services more, just that the data was skewing them and triaging these richer white men for certain services. And this really created a lot of consternation, as it should. So that's one example to show why are we so concerned? Why is trust by design such a critical component of the overall, from ideation through not only to operationalization, but to ongoing monitoring of your AI systems? Because as Rebecca said, they are being exposed to huge data sets and they are learning from that data set. It is not you as the individual human that's going in a rules-based function telling it how to if then. What you're doing is you're exposing the system to a lot of data and having it learn. And as you do that, it learns from the data set and continues to learn. And you're trying to avoid down the line any type of unintended consequence because you hadn't necessarily turned your mind to how this new data might be impacting your system. So trust by design is something that starts at the ideation stage, flows well past the operationalization stage into ongoing monitoring. And what I would just highlight here is this ongoing monitoring. So usually when you have a piece of software, you set and forget, you use it, you might get updates from time, and really you don't really turn your mind to it any more than that. But with the increasing commercialization of AI applications, so having our enterprise use these applications more and more, we have more examples of where they are in the marketplace, and it is critical to have that governance structure around how AI continues to evolve over a period of time. We've seen a whole bunch of frameworks come out about this from the EU, from the OECD, from Canada, with great leadership from CFAR, and from a number of different jurisdictions to help companies think about that overall governance structure that flows well past the sort of immediate deployment of the tech and into ongoing operationalization sort of in perpetuity.
Rebecca, I know you've given a lot of thought to these issues and talk about them a lot. So I'm curious if you just want to add or have a reaction to Carol's remarks.
I think I would just add in, I thought she did a great job of really summarizing the details. So what we're seeing in the research world is that there's sort of a technical response to trying to think about how you embed fairness and accountability and transparency into the research and into the algorithms and the work that's being done. And I think that's critically important, but you cannot underestimate the importance of the diversity of perspectives and people who are around the table and who are engaged in the process. And there's some really interesting models emerging about trying to make sure that we are getting into the room and into the development in the process, whether it's through groups like Black in AI, whether it's through the Diverse Tech Policy Lab at the University of Washington or elsewhere. I mean, there's some really good work being done to think about how we actually get the people and their perspectives into the process to ensure that we are creating systems that are truly accurate and reliable for all segments of the population and for the questions, the really tough questions that we want these systems to tackle.
You mentioned get into the room. That's something that I often hear global affairs people talk about when they talk about Canada's place in this. You know, we have China publicly acknowledging they spent $500 billion on their AI research. The United States is obviously a massive player in this, and then there's Canada. This is what strikes me about this issue, or this sector, I guess, is that it's not just an industry, an economic industry. It's also become a geopolitical space. And I'm curious, maybe start with you, Carol. What role you think Canada can play in bridging that and making sure that we also the militarization or weaponization of AI doesn't become problematic.
Mm-hmm. So we don't have to talk about it in the hypothetical. We can actually talk about the role Canada is playing in the sort of advancement of ethical AI. We have been playing for a number of years. We were the first country to come out with a commitment to a national strategy, a pan-Canadian strategy on AI that Rebecca will talk about because CFAR is leading it. So we don't have to talk about it in the hypothetical. Canada has been very vocal in terms of and active in terms of leading ethical AI, both across Canada, but also through its participation in the OECD, its partnership with France, in which it 2 years ago announced a partnership on ethical AI, and just 2 weeks ago or a week ago, the Minister of Innovation announced a global partnership on AI that is does not only include France, but includes a number of countries that are participating in this global initiative, where we'll be looking at issues such as data governance and responsible AI. Canada has a very strong voice in this. Domestically, we have been not only investing in research and trying to augment commercialization of Canadian innovations, but we released a digital charter a year ago in which the government articulated 10 principles that are very much sort of Canadian principles in a digital economy. And that includes really core Canadian values like inclusiveness, like control, like anti-hate. So these are really critical pieces of the Canadian discourse. And I had the privilege of being involved in those consultations. And I can tell you that what I heard across Canada on behalf of our government is a sincere effort to want to sort of project what the future looks like and how are we going to ensure that Canadians are well trained, are well equipped to deal with the digital economy of the future. But here's the thing, David, the digital economy of the future just got accelerated by 10 years because what we're seeing with the pandemic is there has been massive unemployment in Canada, which is tremendously disheartening and scary. But the question around that is, okay, well, how many of these jobs are likely to come back post-pandemic? And while Canada is very, very different than the US, what I've heard recently in the US in terms of statistics is we've got about 42 of the job loss caused by COVID, around 42% of those jobs are not likely to come back because they are likely to be replaced by automation. And so we really are, what we were projecting for 2030 has now come home very quickly in 2020, and we have to prepare our workforce for that digital economy that we thought we had more time for, and we don't anymore. In terms of the militarization, there is very thoughtful discussion happening at the international level and at the national level around the responsible use of AI in the military context. But I think what we're seeing on the streets is actually not a concern around the military context. What we're seeing on the streets is the use of any technology in our communities by law enforcement. So the sort of defund the police movement in part has been to reallocate resources to be using resources more effectively. And when we've talked about AI in the law enforcement context, oftentimes, instead of promoting the use of AI as a means of identifying trends of crime, we have talked about using artificial intelligence to help identify trends and predictions for social services. So really understanding your community and where it's suffering, as opposed to trying to over-police it.
Rebecca, just picking up on some of those thoughts. Canada, yes, I hear everything that Carol is saying, and certainly we've seen that. However, we still, we're a tiny player on the economic side of this. How, first of all, the private sector and the public sector and how those two things interact in Canada is one question. I mean, Element AI has been traditionally, the leading player on the Canadian side globally, on the policy side as well as a private sector employer, but still a tiny fraction of what China is doing on this. How do we have some, I guess, bite to go with our bark on some of these key issues?
Well, that is definitely a question that would take way more time than you have allotted to me. But let me say a couple of things. One, I think we focus on our strengths, and I think the Pan-Canadian AI strategy focusing on research talent and training and development that's allowed both to retain researchers here in Canada, but also to acquire and bring in researchers into Canada, reversing what we often think of as the Canadian brain drain, was a pivotal investment in that process, and we're seeing that pay off in terms of clusters of startups and hubs that are emerging around the AI institutes, but also more broadly in centers across Canada. So I think focusing on our strengths and investing in our strengths is a key part of that. We did a review of national AI strategies a year ago. We've just updated it. So I think we're now at over 20, around 28 or so national or supranational strategies that are out there. They're all, the one thing that you can say about them is that each of is unique. There's not really one thing that's called an AI strategy, which is also sort of an interesting policy question in and of itself. So the fact that ours is funded, it's maybe not as large as some of the industrial AI strategies that we've seen, but actually funded and in place and underway, I think is a critical strength for Canada moving forward. And then it's thinking about how we create those startup clusters. I was very happy to see earlier this week that Kinaxis was acquiring RoboCloud. So we were seeing internal in Canada domestic acquisitions of some of the startups that we're developing. Where you can think about the success of Layer 6 and its acquisition by the TD Bank, and then now we have Radical Ventures that Jordan Jacob leads, which is bringing more funding into the market. So I think focusing on our strengths and what we do is critical. I think the responsible development component that Carol talked about in terms of the digital charter and the digital values is key. It's key both in terms of the domestic acceptance and adaptation and use of tech here by citizens, but it's also key to our role internationally.
Great. I want to get to some questions here. We don't have that much time left, and I'll just kind of try to summarize a bunch of the questions into one. There's a lot of concern about contact tracing, and two parts to it, really. The one part of that where there's concern is how do you get it into the hands of all Canadians? If you just think of who has phones and who has data plans and who doesn't, is there a discriminatory element of a contact tracing app, and how do we manage that? And Rebecca, I'll go to you for these first. And then the second question is, how do we prevent inappropriate use or misuse of any data collected during this pandemic? Are there fines that should be starting to be implemented? Are there, legal frameworks that we should consider that we haven't already? What kind of tools do we have to use as a stick for anybody who abuses that data? Rebecca, I'll start with you.
Great. So just to turn to the report that the expert group in Canada that we brought together to look specifically at novel technologies in a pandemic, and then put together some implementation guidelines that were critical through the principles that were established. So the recommendation from the group was that there be consideration given for a legal framework, that there was unique enough characteristics around this, and the fact that the shared public health authority between the provinces and the federal government, and that needed to be considered as one element to ensure that the safeguards that you mentioned are in place to manage the technology moving forward. And then there must be clear transparency, openness, and security associated with the app. So that's the comprehensive and transparent communication plan that we already spoke about. That's public feedback. That's also mandating that the source code is open and available for scrutiny from independent experts and the broader public. That's also thinking about all of the elements of the Privacy Commissioner's framework that was released. And what does that mean? It's about data limitation, so ensuring that the data is not going to be used for law enforcement or other areas, and then ensuring that there's a strong accountability and oversight mechanism in place. So that's using all of the tools and committees and structures that are already in place, but also thinking about potentially putting in place an independent advisory board to address some of those equity questions that you brought up, David. So how do we ensure that all segments of the population benefit and are not stigmatized in any way from the use of an app?
Carol, I want you to answer that as well, but I just want to, there's one more question here that I'm hoping maybe you can step back and provide a 30,000-foot view on some of the complex policy challenges. You mentioned automation and its replacing of jobs. At the same time, there are aging out boomers, as somebody answered a question here, meaning we're going to have this gap. How do you get a sense, or do you have confidence that the government is looking at everything, whether through the Future Skills Center or through AI policy development, that there is a full 360 view in government of all of these complex challenges and how AI and data integrates into them?
I think there is a fair assessment of the different groups, but I think that there is a little bit of a gap in making sure that we understand what the full picture looks like, because we have, if you look at sort of the data landscape, we have the Privacy Commissioner that is very much looking at the use of personal information in the context of private sector, particularly. You have the Competition Commissioner that is looking at various aspects of the use of data when it comes to data monopolies or data cartels or false advertising, things like that. And interestingly, in the Minister of Innovation's mandate letter, there was a discussion of, do we need a data commissioner? And we haven't really heard much about that since, but it's really, there's a real opportunity there to make sure that all of these different questions and the entire view of what does data, who's got overall governance and regulation over both personal and non-personal information, and looking at it from different segments of society to ensure that we're not missing something that's really critical. Again, as a compendium to that, I'll sort of turn to CFAR, that's done a lot of work in AI and society, also trying to look at and research various sectors that intersect with AI that are not specific to the research of technical components, but really looking at how that fits within the broader societal context. So I think we see it on the civil society side, we see it in the academic context, we see the government that has a number of different tools available to it. There is this potential gap that might be filled by a new position, by a new regulator, and we'll have to see what that looks like going forward. But it is a critical question, and it's one that can't wait. So how are we going to ensure that senior citizens or people who don't have phones, people who don't have data plans, are able to download this app and participate in the process should they so choose? And I think there's a role for government and potentially for employers to step in and provide that equipment, provide that plan so that people can participate if they want to and if they choose to download the app. Just going back to the question of how do we make sure there isn't independent or sort of inappropriate use, I agree with everything that Rebecca said. I think it is really critical to have some clear oversight. I would strongly recommend a transparency report that comes out regularly, that provides clear data, that is overseen by privacy commissioners, that includes privacy commissioners, and that demonstrates how data is used, where is it stored, how is it deleted, and when is it deleted? And then allowing that for peer review is really critical. For some kind of external review to confirm that you are doing what you say you're doing is critical.
I think if there's one thing to take away from today, it's that this is such a live file. What we were going to talk about versus what we actually ended up talking about were very different. And I think that's because the nature of this is changing so frequently, which is why I'm so grateful that all three of you took the time out of your busy days to talk to us and provide some context on these really important issues. Microsoft's CEO, Satya Nadella, has talked about the erosion of social capital from all of our virtual lives and through Microsoft team fatigue and other things. I hope that we gained some social capital today in this conversation and didn't erode any. And I'm really deeply thankful to Microsoft on behalf of The Logic for allowing us to have this conversation and for giving us this chance to talk about these issues. In 12 minutes, the Premier of Ontario will be speaking about today's announcement on contact tracing, and I encourage you all to listen to that, and I encourage you also to read up on the latest at thelogic.co, where our reporter Murad Hamadi and Marty Patriquin have been on top of this from the very beginning. With that, I'd like to thank Carol, Rebecca, and John and Microsoft for having us, and like to thank all of you for participating and for watching. I'm David Skok. Have a great afternoon. Thank you so much.
Thank you.